All right. And so we are done with 1 Samuel. One book down, 3 to go. So the book of 2 Samuel is pretty much the life of David or the reign of David. And it'll end then with a handing over to Solomon. So it's very easy to remember in that stage that there's only one king in 1 Samuel. There's one king in 2 Samuels. Not exactly, there's another one in there, but that's fine. You know, he's there and he's gone very quickly. So what happened? In 2 Samuel then, it kicks off with exactly what you asked earlier, Pam. That man who rocked up there with a crown and says, and I think it was the wrist bands or something like that from Saul as well. And he came running and found David and said to him, look, I found him on the battlefield. I think he said he was wounded and I took his life. And here it is. The Lord promised that he will give you the crown of Israel. Here it is. And David's reply is simply, you have just, by your own confession, declared that you have killed the anointed of the Lord, and therefore your life will be taken. He tells the one man, cut him down, and he dies. And then he goes and writes a song, and it's the song, the lament for Saul, and the lament for Jonathan. Now, Jonathan, you understand, but who wants to write a song for the man that hunted him down, that mistreated him completely while he was a faithful servant to him? Think about that. You're fired somewhere, and a boss just breaks you down. You've done nothing wrong. You're accused of things you haven't done, and you go away and you sit with the Lord, and you write a song in his honor. That's just a completely different spirit in this man. Completely different. And then he then uses his authority, sends it out through the land and says, let this song always be sung in Israel. In other words, let Saul be remembered like this, and let Jonathan be remembered like this. How beautiful is that? He wants everybody to remember the good of this courageous man. And he then does a bit of a political move, all right? He's still in Philistine territory, and he uses that massive loot that he got together out of that battle against the Amalekites, saving their own families. And he starts sending gifts all throughout the land of Judah, saying, thank you so much, Moabites, that you looked after my parents. Here's a gift for you. Here, elders of Judah, here's a gift for you. And you guys are my brothers. Here's a gift for you. And he starts winning the favor of the people, saying, listen, remember me. I'm still here in Philistine territory. And so the people of Judah say, David is anointed. He's our own flesh and blood. We know that the Spirit of the Lord is on him. He's always fought Saul's battles for us and won victories for us. We will anoint him as king. Abner, however, took Ishbosheth and said, you are the son of Saul, after Jonathan. And he went and made him king. Now, he's going to be over here, actually. Yeah. Because the nation is not officially split up yet. They just undecided who's going to be who. And you'll see tomorrow, under Rehoboam, it's going to be official. We want nothing to do with you. We want nothing to do with you. And so for a period of time, they have these 2 kings, one up in the north, one down in the south. And there's a battle between these 2 families. And the house of David grew stronger and stronger. But the actual authority up in the north was not Ishbosheth. It was Abner. He is the one that took him and said, this is your king. And it quickly becomes apparent that he calls the shots. And so down in the south, the commander of the army is Joab, and his 2 brothers under him, Abishai and Asahel. And I think in this time of the story, we can learn actually so much more from the commanders in the army than from the kings. I always think for myself, I'm not a supreme authority. Okay? I cannot just make my own decisions. I am a man under authority. Rob and the elders of the church, they're my boss. And I think most of us find ourselves in work situations like that there's somebody over us. So to a large extent, the king is not really the way that I can operate. I'm not sovereign. I cannot just do what I want to do. But the commander of the armies is very much my kind of story. And if we look at their attitudes towards those that they serve, none of them match up to David. Even when mistreated, he remained faithful. He remained honoring, and he remained true. He's sort of like the perfect picture for us of how you act under authority. And these other guys are just about to show us how not to do it. So there's a massive battle between the north and the south. And Joab is running the show on the one hand, Abner on the other side. And David's army is pursuing the Israelites. They're starting to run. And in that run, Asahel, the younger brother of Joab, we're told he was as fleet-footed as a gazelle. And he decides, I want the main Canaan. I'm going after Abner. Abner has always been the commander of the army for Saul. That would be a massive prize to take. Abner is the real power up there. And he wants that guy under his belt. And so he's running after Abner with all of his might. And Abner calls back and said, is that you, Asahel, chasing me? Running. He says, turn to the right or to the left. How can I strike you down and face your brother Joab again? Take one of these guys or one of those guys. But he doesn't want to give up. He's chasing him and gaining on him. And after warning him again, Abner just takes the butts of his spear and hits him in the tummy. And at the speed that he's running, it goes straight through and he dies on the spot. And from that day on, Joab had this real vrok against Abner for killing his brother. But it was on the battlefield, right? It was like fair game. It was either kill or be killed. And they kept on chasing the Israelites that day until Abner finally called out, Joab, when will you stop? Don't you know that this is only going to end in disaster? In other words, this is brothers fighting brothers, and you're just killing us down now. And Joab shouts back, if you did not call out now, we would not have stopped until we've completely destroyed you. And they turned around and went back home. But for a while still, this battle every now and again flared up, because both of them wanted to reign over the entire land. Then at one stage, Abner takes one of the concubines of Saul, the previous king, and sleeps with her. And Ishbosheth hears about this. And he confronts him, because that's not right. She's a royal woman. And Abner just is completely angry, flares out at Ishbosheth and says, what am I, a dog in Israel that you speak to me like that? If it's not for me, you would not have been on the throne. In fact, I have it in my heart to make sure that today the tribes of Israel all go over to David. And so he sends a message to David and says, I want to meet with you. I want to bring the elders and speak on your behalf and get you the crown. Because of what? Because he was insulted. He couldn't do what he wanted to do. Right? There's no loyalty at all. Nothing. And consider this, if he walks over to David with the elders following him, he's got a lot of clout with David, right? He still wants to call the shots. And so he does come and meet with David. And at that time, Joab and Abishai is not there. And he comes, has his meeting, and agrees, I will go and speak to the elders of Israel, and we will make this happen. And as he just leaves the city, Joab and Abishai rocks up in the city, and they told Abner was here, and he came and he went in peace. And he sends a message back to Abner along the road and says, come quickly. The king has another message for you before you go. And he turns around, he comes back, and as he comes into the city, he takes him one side, just in secret, and takes his dagger and stabs it in his stomach and kills him on the spot. Murder. That's not a battle. And it's for killing his brother. Interesting thing is, David never does anything about it. And really from now on out, you're going to count the events, the amount of time that Joab does exactly what he wants and defies the king's authority, and nothing gets done. And it really is that kind of picture, if you think about it's brothers in arms. You know, back there we were in the cave together, and you had my back, I had your back. How can I now kill you for committing murder? That's what should have happened. But it's really like, okay, just overlook it. And it gets worse and worse. He takes bigger and bigger advantage of it. But now David has a real problem because the commander of the north came to him in peace and he's murdered in his city. And it clearly looks like this is David's doing. I mean, why not? You know? And he had to make it really clear. So he puts on sackcloth and he mourns for him. And he sends a message out to the entire land and says, do you not know that a mighty warrior have fallen in Israel today? And because of how he goes about it, it's clear to everybody this was not David. This was not David. David did not want to do it. This is the sons of Zeruiah, Joab and his brother. Well, with Abner gone in the north, now there's a real power struggle because Ishbosheth is still the king, but, you know, he doesn't really run it. And so two of his servants goes quietly into his bedroom, kills him, cuts off his head, comes over the border to David and presents it and says, yeah, it's yours now. David's response is exactly the same as it was with the man who came and said that I killed Saul. He says, you should not have laid your hands on the Lord's anointed. Now again, who's the Lord's anointed? It's actually David, but this is a king. And he sees it in the same light. He says, whether God have chosen him or not, you have chosen him, and now he's murdered. And so he kills them. And with that, the 10 tribes of the north come and says, David, reign over us. We agree, you are our king. And finally, he reigns over the whole nation. We need David up there. Baie dankie, Wim. And now, David starts rising in power. And just follow along in your manual over there because it's a whole bunch of battles mentioned with 2 stories in between. And the map here shows how from the time that David comes onto the throne, the territory just is broadened out. And finally, Israel is exactly the borders that God promised to Abraham and that he confirmed to Jacob. It's literally, God gave them the borders, says this territory belongs to you. And then to Moses, confirmed in the desert, finally given to Joshua and say, this is the land. Remember, before they went into the promised land, it was already divided up. It says, you guys take that allotment, you guys take that. Only under David now, they finally reach the borders, all the way from the Valley of Egypt until the Euphrates River up in the top. It's massive. Compared to the small little country today, it's a huge territory. That's the whole of the Aram district, that's the whole of the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, all of these guys, up until the desert here on the right-hand side. So really, this list of battles just emphasizes the scripture that says there, 2 Samuel 8, the Lord gave David victory wherever he went. And it's just those couple of chapters, 5 chapters, emphasizes it. So he conquers Jerusalem, makes it a capital city, the city of peace. And then he defeats the Philistines, which Saul could never do. They kept on being a pain to him. And then as newly appointed king over Israel, David ensures that God is glorified in Israel by bringing the ark into the newly captured capital city. And as soon as he made that known to God, he stood in his own palace, and the king Hiram from up in the north sent woodcutters and wood and built him a palace in his capital city. He stood in it and says, Lord, wow, now I know that I found favor. The enemies from way up there came and built me a palace in my own capital city. And when he stood in that looking out, he saw, but the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent. He says, Lord, how's that? That's not right. And his heart just burned for that. And he said, God, I want to build you a house. I want to glorify your name and make sure that there's foundations under you being with me in the city. And when he said that to God, God said, you know what? There will never not be a king sitting on your throne for all of eternity. That's what God responded to. It's just this absolute honor and the love that he had for him to say, that's the kind of king that will forever reign. That will never end. And the rest of the story, as we're going to see, is just the exact show of that. The fulfillment of a promise made to a man on the reaction of that man's love demonstrated to him. And it's beautiful. Yeah. Then do go and read. I'm not going to tell the entire story of it now, but there was this whole thing about bringing the ark into the capital city. First time round, they did it wrong. They thought it's convenient, it looks better, let's just put it on a cart, a new cart. I mean, it's a beautiful new cart, and let's just pull it in there, and everybody dancing around it. And suddenly it stumbles, and a man puts out his hand, Uzzah, just to stop it from stumbling, and God shows, that's unacceptable. You cannot do that. You cannot go around with the ark of God like that. And the man dies on the spot. And David says, I don't think I want this in you anymore. Who can dwell with God in the middle of the city? You know, you really have to walk fine when you were a holy God. And then the house that it's seen to starts prospering. And it must have happened just like that, because it says the Lord opened up wounds and everything just lived in this house. And it was so evident that David says, I really do want it. And he told the priests, guys, we better do it right this time. It's because we didn't know the law, we didn't follow God's instructions. Let's do it right. And they brought it in. But now, this shows us why God said, you're not going to be the one that's going to build me a house. Because he was truly a man of war in every respect. A man of psalms and songs and all of that, yes, but a man of war. And the Lord gave him victory wherever he went. But there's these stories of how he just would lay down people on the ground, lying flat, and then he'd measured off. Okay, dead, alive. You guys dead, you guys alive. The amount of blood that was shed by this man is really phenomenal. Because he fulfilled the command that God gave. Said, this territory, they must go. The Canaanites must pay for what they have done. And what have they done? They built these altars made out of copper, put flames behind it to heat it up, and took their babies and put them in the hands of these idols, burned them alive. It's not just that they did bad business. They were worshiping demons, full out. And it's a horrible thing to hear, but we have to hear it, because later on the Israelites are going to do the same, and God's going to say, you also will not stay in this land. You also I will take out, because that I will not tolerate. It's a balance of it. So by the end of that, when he's taken out the Moabites and Zobah and the Arameans and the Amalekites and the Edomites, he comes to a point and he says, what can I do for Jonathan and for Saul to honor their memory? And he sends somebody out and says, go and have a look. One of these servants of Saul was Ziba in the palace, and he said to him, go and find me a family member of Jonathan. And they find him this man called Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth was dropped by a maid when he was very young, so he was lame. And when he was brought to David, he was just so humbled, and he says, why would you want to do anything good for me? A mere dog. He calls himself actually a dead dog. He says, what can I offer you? And he says, no, but it's for Jonathan's sake. Come and stay with me in the palace. You will always eat at my table. And all the territory that belonged to Saul, the king, I will give to you. It's yours. Hey? How awesome is that? Every other king that we're going to learn later on, they assassinate the previous king and then they take out his entire family. David does exactly the opposite. Hey? He seeks out and says, come and stay with me in the palace. You're not going to benefit me anything. I mean, you can't even walk. Just stay with me. Eat at my table and take everything that belonged to your dad. It's yours. Completely different heart than all the others. And later on, it's going to be a bit of a scheming between Ziba and Mephibosheth. If we turn the page then, we unfortunately read, after all this great success, how David starts to stumble. And this is going to kickstart a story that's not just a one-pager, because it's going to become a national war, infighting in the family that broadens out to a war in the nation. David's going to open the door for sin to come in, and it's going to cause so much more destruction than what he ever could think. So he's been fighting and fighting and fighting, and then it says it came to a stage where David stayed at home at the time when kings went out to war. And the army was sent with Joab and says, you go fight the war. He's comfortable in the palace. Was he growing older? Yes. But the way that Scripture says it sounds like that's not what should have happened. While he was in the palace, he also went on the roof of his palace in the daytime that he shouldn't have been on there. His roof is obviously higher than the neighbors, and he's looking over and he sees a young lady taking a bath next door. And then he sends a message. He says, who is that? That's Uriah's wife, he's told. He says, go and get her. Takes her into his bedroom. By this time, he has 8 wives of his own. And he sleeps with her and he sends her back home. And then sometime later, she sends a message and says, I'm pregnant. Oops, this is going to come out. Because her husband is fighting for David on the battlefield, risking his life. And so he's scheming and scheming, and how this man that's been walking with God at this stage is just so blinded to what he is doing. I don't understand, but I understand he is a man and I'm one too. May I never get to that point. And then he sends a message off to Joab and says, send me Uriah the Hittite. Uriah arrives at the palace, comes straight to the palace, doesn't even go home. And he comes and tells David, this is what's happening. News from the battlefield. And David says, all right, just wait here, and tomorrow I will send you home. Off to the battlefield again, sorry. And he sleeps that night in the gate, and he's told the next morning, so his attendants must know what's happening here. He's told Uriah didn't go home. He slept in the gate. Oh, that's not going to help. So he invites him to a meal, and he makes him drunk. He says, wait here, I'll send you off to the battlefield tomorrow. And even though he was intoxicated, he refused to go back home. He's sleeping in the gate. When David would ask him about it, he says, hey, the armies of Israel are on the battlefield risking their lives. How can I go home and sleep with my wife? What an honorable man. Such a contrast to David at this moment. And then David realized, well, this is not going to happen. I'm going to have to kill him. And so he sends Uriah off to the battlefield to Joab with a letter signing his own death. It says, Joab, take Uriah, put him in the front line where the battle is fiercest. And at the moment of the heat of battle, withdraw from him and let him be struck down. Joab does that. And when the message is sent back home, a report from the battle, Joab is very careful because he knows the king is going to get angry because it was a stupid strategy that was followed. So he says to the man, when you tell the king we came this close to the gate and some of our men fell, the king is going to flare up and he's going to say, why did you do that? Wasn't it so-and-so that died when they chucked a millstone on his head from the wall? I mean, it's silly. Why did you do it? Then just reply, your servant Uriah the Hittite also fell. So keep in mind, it's not just one man that fell. There was a couple of men dying because of the king's willful, bad decision. Well, the message does come back to David. Bathsheba mourns, and after her mourning, he takes her into the palace and he marries her. This is not going to go away. I do have to mention at that stage that one of the advisors of the king that we're going to meet later on is the grandfather of Bathsheba. And he's going to be one of those to partner with Absalom against him. So nobody really forgot this incident. The sad thing is, at this point, Nathan is sent to David. And Nathan comes with a story. He says, King, there's a man in your kingdom who has many sheep. He's wealthy. His neighbor only has one sheep, and this sheep grew up in his arms like a little daughter of him. He stays in the house with him, sleeps in his bed. The rich man had some guests, and so he sent his servants over to the poor man and says, go and get that sheep. And he slaughtered the sheep and served it to his guests. And David naturally becomes furious and says, who is this man? He must pay for what he did. And Nathan says, you are that man. And suddenly, conviction struck. And he continues to say, God says, I've given you all that your heart desires. I've given you a kingdom to reign over, all that your heart desires. And I would have given you so much more. Why then did you kill Uriah to take his wife? And then he's told the child will die. She was still pregnant, and when the child came, the child became ill. And we're told that David acted really strangely according to his attendants. He fasted, he didn't want to eat, he didn't want to wash. He sat with sackcloth and ashes, and he prayed and pleaded for the child. And then when they were told the child is dead, none of their the servants wanted to come and tell him that because they thought he's going to do something crazy. They've urged him already a couple of days and says, just eat, please, just bath, get up from the ground. And when he heard them chattering in the chamber, he said, what is it? Has the child died? And they said, yes, King, he did. And so David got up and he washed. He says, please bring me food. And they said, what are you doing? While the child was still alive, you were in this state. And now that the child is dead, you eating? He says, well, while the child lived, I thought I could plead with the Lord. Maybe the Lord will be gracious. Maybe he will forgive and save the child. But now that the child is dead, it's these beautiful words. He cannot come to me, but I will come to him. Okay? There will be a day where I will go to him. And after her mourning, she fell pregnant again, and a child was born by the name of, anybody? Solomon. And Solomon would eventually become the next king. Now the story continues. It's not over yet. Because now suddenly, David has opened up a door. And Nathan had to tell him as a warning, the Lord says, that which you've done in secret will be done in public to you. He slept with his neighbor's wife in secret. The Lord is warning him. That's going to be done to you in public. And then also a clear warning, somebody from your own house. So he was expecting this is going to have repercussions. What is lovely, though, the moment that Solomon is born, it says, Solomon was born and the Lord loved him. Isn't that beautiful? David is forgiven by God. He truly is. He repented and God forgave him. God is not holding a grudge against this marriage. He's not holding a grudge against this child. But he is saying, you opened a door, David. This is going to have consequences in your reign. It's going to have consequences in your own house. It's going to be repercussions. And we have to be aware of that. When we ourselves commit sin, I can repent, but am I closing doors? I say, God, please, I know I've opened. There's going to be consequences here. So Amnon falls in love with his half-sister, Tamar, and that's the name of the moms at the top. So Ahinoam and Maacah are two of David's wives. And Amnon has an advisor friend who is quite a shrewd man. So he checks out Abner and he says, listen, you're so befoeted every day. What's going on? You mislook. Hey? Can the king's son walk around like that? What's wrong? He says, well, I'm in love with Tamar. I'm just absolutely besotted with her. And I don't know what to do about it. And so the shrewd friend of his says, well, I'll tell you what to do. Make as if you're sick. Go and lie in your bed, and if the king come and ask what's wrong with you, say, oh, I'm not feeling lekker. Please, would you not send me my lovely sister Tamar, just to come and make me some bread here in my presence, and let me eat from her hand. The king says nothing in it. He says, sure. He sends Tamar around, and Tamar sees nothing in it. Seems quite natural to just help her brother while she's sick, while he's sick, seeming to be. And then once she's made the bread, everything is ready, the meal, he sends everybody out of the room and says, Tamar, please just come here to the bed and bring it to me, that I can eat from your hands. And he grabs her and he rapes her. And the moment the deed is done, it says, he hated her even more than he loved her before. And he said, get up and leave my house. And she tore her clothes. I says, please, please, what you are doing now is worse than you have just done to me. Please just ask Dad. He will not refuse me to be married to you. And he says, no. He calls his attendants back in. He says, get this woman out of my sight. And she goes back home weeping with ashes on her head. And when Absalom, her full brother from the same mother, finds her like that, he takes her into her house and says, please, 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 just keep quiet about this. Don't take this matter to heart. Well, how can she not? And from that day on, Absalom had this grudge against Amnon and was looking for an opportunity to harm him. But it was some time later only that he actually put it in action. A real shrewd guy. He was shearing his sheep, and so he asked his dad, please, Dad, you and all my brothers come around to my house and let's just have a lovely festival out there to celebrate the shearing of the sheep. And Dad says, man, we're going to be a burden on you. You go and enjoy it. He says, but please, let my brothers come at least. And so Dad says, fine, sees nothing bad in it. And Amnon is among them. And he tells two of their descendants, wait for a moment that I give you the sign, and as soon as I give you the sign, strike Amnon down, kill him on the spot. Don't be afraid, I'm giving you the command. And sure enough, the festival is happening, and all of a sudden he gives them the sign, and they kill their brother right there in the middle of all the other brothers. All of the other brothers jump up there on their camels, and they're running for their lives. And a message comes to David back in the palace and says, all of your sons are killed by Absalom. Imagine the shock that comes over Dad. And he's up on the roof of the palace, and then suddenly one of the men says, oh, no. There, look, a whole bunch of guys on camels coming over. It's not all of your sons. I just heard just Amnon, because he always had a grudge against him because of what happened with Tamar. And then Absalom had to flee the country. He murdered his brother. And went up into the north, hiding away. I think it's something like 3 years later, before finally Joab gets away of getting him back into the country. I just want to put a picture up of another brother and remember it, just all the brothers in line, because these are the only sons of David that we ever have dealings with in the story. At another time, Adonia, I always have it in Afrikaans. You'll hear many of my names are very Afrikaans. He actually makes a go at the crown as well. So just remember him together with the others, but you'll see him later. So David is mourning for his son Amnon, but as time goes on, he realizes, I've got another son who's out there hiding from me, because I'm supposed to be the one to be the judge in the land, to call it to justice. And he cannot come back. And Joab gets in between in the story and starts conniving. Whether he thinks he's doing a good thing or not is actually difficult to say at this time. But he calls a very clever actress woman, and puts word in her mouth and says, come and speak to the king, bring your case to the king. And she comes, she plays the role, and she says to him, King David, I had 2 sons. The 2 of them got into a fight with one another, and the one accidentally killed the other one. And now the elders of the town where I live is saying they're looking for my son because they want to kill him because he committed murder. Please, King, have grace on me. I don't want to lose both my sons. I don't have a husband anymore. It's the only 2 I have. And the king is gracious. He says, listen, I'll speak up for you. Just tell me, I'll speak to the elders of your town and I'll have your son spared. And then she says, King, please, don't be angry, but let me speak a bit more. Don't you judge yourself when you say this to me, because your son Absalom is still out in hiding because he killed his brother. Difficult, isn't it? And so he says, well, don't keep it from me. Is it Joab that's with you in this? And the woman had to say, yes, King. You're just like an angel of God. You know, it is Joab. So he calls Joab in and he says, Joab, go and get my son Absalom. He brings him back home after 3 years, and the only condition was Absalom is never allowed to see the king's face. So he has to stay in confinement in Jerusalem, which for a while is fine. But then after a couple of years, Absalom sends a message to Joab and says, please, Joab, come and see me. I need to speak to you. Joab doesn't come. Absalom doesn't have clout anymore. He cannot just call and people come, right? And so he says, all right. He sends his servants out and says, go burn down Joab's grain field. And they go and burn down his field, and obviously now Joab comes. Why have your servant burned down my grain field? He says, but I called you to come and you didn't want to come. What a reckless man. What a scolly, huh? Absolutely. So now Joab's there and he says, I want to speak to the king. Why did you bring me back here if I cannot even see the king's face? I should have just stayed where I was up there in the north, all right? And then Joab comes and speaks for Absalom in David's presence, and finally David agrees, and Absalom comes and sees his face. And they hug. They'd really missed. And from that day on, Absalom started to conspire against the king. He hired a bunch of men to chase behind him. You know these black limousines on the highways? Had a whole entourage wherever he went, called attention to himself. And every day he would go and stand outside the palace gate. And when anybody wanted to come in to go and see the king with something that he had to judge over, they would pass him, and he is a prince, and he's dressed in royal clothes, and he's exceedingly beautiful. We're told there was not a man as beautiful as him in all the country. So everybody passing by him at the gate would bow down because he's a prince. And then he would quickly grab them up and hug them and kiss them. And he says, what are you coming in for today? I've got this case. The king needs to hear it. He says, the king's too busy. He won't be able to see you today. If only they would make me judge in the land. Yeah, I would quickly sort these things out, but I'm sorry for you. You can go back home. And so he won over their favor, playing politics, stirring the heart of the people and stealing it away from David to himself. Until finally his conspiracy became stronger and stronger. And there were 2 men together with him, Amasa and Ahithophel. Amasa was a cousin of David, or a cousin actually of Absalom. And so from David's side of the family back in Jesse's sister Abigail, he's from that line. And Ahithophel is Bathsheba's granddad. Can you think why he would conspire against David? You killed my granddaughter's husband. That's a good motive right there. And unfortunately, he was an exceptionally clever man. We're told that if you inquired of Ahithophel in those years, it was like asking from the lips of God himself. His wisdom was regarded as this. He's a very strong ally. David has trouble coming. We'll stop the story here for now. Quickly have a 5-minute chat or stretch your legs there around the table, and then we'll continue.